28-year-old Kyriaki Griva walked into that police station the way people walk into churches during storms, desperate, shaken, holding on to the last thin thread of hope she had left. She told the officers inside that her ex-boyfriend was stalking her again, that she had seen him near her home, that she didn't feel safe. All she wanted was an escort for a 5-minute drive, just someone in uniform sitting beside her so she could breathe long enough to reach her front door. But the officers told her to call a hotline instead, so Kyriaki stepped back outside, alone, holding her phone like it was the only lifeline she had left. And as she listened to the operator explain that police cars are not taxis, a shadow moved behind her, a shape she'd spent years trying to outrun. Before she could turn, before she could scream, before anyone inside that station even looked up, a knife plunged into her back. Once, twice, 5 times, she collapsed on the pavement, mere meters from the building that was supposed to save her. Her murder was caught on camera, her killer never fled, and the people she begged for help never stepped outside, until it was already too late. This is the story of Kyriaki Griva, a story of a system that didn't just fail her, it abandoned her. Kyriaki Griva was 28 years old and living in northern Athens, trying to build a life free from the man who had terrorized her for years. She was the daughter of Thanasis Grivas and Despina Kalia, raised in a family that loved her and wanted nothing more than to see her happy and safe. But happiness and safety had become impossible luxuries the moment Thanasis Kyriakis entered her life. Kyriakis was 10 years older than Kyriaki, a gap that might seem insignificant on paper but often translates to a power imbalance in relationships, especially when one partner is controlling and manipulative. They had been in an on-again, off-again relationship, the kind of toxic cycle that domestic violence experts recognize immediately. The pattern of breaking up and getting back together, of promises to change followed by renewed abuse, of hope crushed under the weight of reality again and again. In 2020, Kyriaki made a brave decision. She left Kyriakis and filed formal complaints against him. But it wasn't just complaints about arguments or verbal abuse. Kyriaki accused Kyriakis of rape. She stated explicitly and repeatedly that she had not consented, that he had violated her in the most brutal way imaginable while she was pregnant. The violation of someone carrying a child adds another layer of horror to an already unthinkable crime. Kyriaki had made her accusation clear in writing, establishing beyond any doubt that this was rape under Greek law. A restraining order was granted, a piece of paper that was supposed to create a barrier between Kyriaki and her abuser. But like so many restraining orders in domestic violence cases, it proved to be worth less than the paper it was printed on. Kyriakis didn't respect it, and more damningly, the system didn't enforce it properly. Here's where the first critical failure occurred, a failure that would ultimately cost Kyriaki her life. Although she had filed the rape complaint, Kyriaki chose not to actively pursue the charge during her time at the police station. This is not unusual behavior for rape victims. The trauma of reporting sexual assault, the invasive questions, the judgment, the fear of not being believed, all of these factors can make victims hesitate to follow through with formal prosecution. But here's the crucial detail that makes what happened next unforgivable. Under Greek law, rape is prosecuted ex officio. That means the state has a legal obligation to pursue the case even without the victim's active involvement. The police are required to investigate and prosecute rape cases, regardless of whether the victim wants to continue pushing the matter. It's a protection built into the system specifically to help victims who are too traumatized or too afraid to fight their attackers in court. But the police in Kyriaki's case didn't do their job. They filed a complaint related only to physical injury and let the rape allegation disappear into bureaucratic limbo. Think about what that meant. Kyriakis had raped Kyriaki while she was pregnant. She had reported it clearly and explicitly. The law required police to act, and they didn't. They had a chance to put him behind bars, to remove him from her life permanently, to show him that his actions had consequences. Instead, they filed paperwork about bruises and closed the case. That failure, that one institutional negligence, set the stage for murder 3 years later. Kyriaki tried to move on with her life. She had broken free from Kyriakis in 2020. She had the restraining order. She was living in northern Athens, presumably trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy and safety. But abusers don't let go easily, especially when they've escaped serious consequences for their previous crimes. Kyriakis had gotten away with rape. He had learned that the system wouldn't protect Kyriaki, that restraining orders were just suggestions he could ignore. If police had checked Kyriakis's background properly, they would have found a concerning history. Reports filed against him in 2024, violence against police officers, drug offenses. This wasn't a man who had one bad moment in a relationship. This was someone with a pattern of violence and criminal behavior, someone who posed a genuine threat to anyone around him. But the background checks weren't done. The rape case wasn't pursued. The restraining order wasn't adequately enforced. And Kyriaki was left to navigate her life with the constant awareness that her abuser was out there somewhere, free and unpunished, nursing his grievances and his obsession. April 1st, 2024. The day that would become Kyriaki's last day on Earth. She met a friend at a cafe, a normal social activity that should have been pleasant and unremarkable. But as they sat there, Kyriaki noticed something that made her blood run cold. Kyriakis was in the vicinity. He was watching her. He was stalking her, lurking near her home, monitoring her movements like a predator circling prey. The fear that gripped Kyriaki in that moment was the fear that domestic violence victims live with every single day. The hypervigilance, the constant checking over your shoulder, the way your heart races when you see a silhouette that might be him, the knowledge that your ex-partner knows where you live, where you work, where you spend your time, and that no piece of paper can truly stop him if he decides to act. Kyriaki was smart. She didn't try to go home alone. She asked her male friend to accompany her to the police station in Agior Anagiroy, her local station, the place that should have been a sanctuary. She reported that Kyriakis had been loitering near her home, that she was afraid, that she needed help. And here's where we need to understand something crucial about how domestic violence victims interact with police. Kyriaki declined to make a formal complaint on that specific occasion. To outsiders, this might seem strange. If she was afraid, why not file paperwork? Why not make it official? But people who work with domestic violence victims understand perfectly. Making a formal complaint is terrifying. It means your abuser will definitely know you reported him. It means potentially triggering an escalation in violence. It means going through a process that can be re-traumatizing, especially when you've already been failed by that same system before. Some victims also lack faith in security agencies after previous experiences where police didn't take them seriously or didn't follow through on protections. Kyriaki had already reported rape and watched the police do nothing. Why would she have faith they would protect her now? So instead of filing formal paperwork, she made a simple, reasonable request. She asked for a police escort home. It was evening. Her stalker was outside. She just needed officers to drive her the 5 minutes to her house, to ensure she got inside safely, to show Kyriakis that police were aware of the situation and watching. It was the bare minimum the police could have done. It would have cost them perhaps 10 minutes of time and a small amount of fuel. It would have saved her life. But the officers on duty, identified as 2 women officers in some reports, refused her request. They told her to call the police hotline instead, to contact the emergency response department. Some press reports indicated the duty officer told Kyriaki that no vehicles were available to transport her, even though a car and driver were reportedly present at the station at that very moment. It was a lie or an excuse, a bureaucratic brush-off that signed Kyriaki's death warrant. So Kyriaki walked outside the police station to make the telephone call. She stood there in the evening air, vulnerable and alone, calling the emergency hotline while officers sat inside the building doing nothing. The operator who answered her call would deliver words that would become infamous throughout Greece, words that would appear on protest signs and spark national outrage. The operator told her, "Lady, police cars are not taxis." Let that sink in for a moment. A woman standing outside a police station, terrified of her stalker ex-boyfriend who had raped her and gotten away with it, begging for help, and the response was to mock her request as if she were asking for a free ride to the mall. The callousness is breathtaking. The lack of humanity is incomprehensible. The failure to recognize danger is criminally negligent. While Kyriaki was on that phone call, while the operator was taking her details and lecturing her about how patrol cars aren't taxis, Thanasis Kyriakis approached from behind. He was 39 years old, 10 years her senior, the man who had raped her, controlled her, stalked her, and terrorized her. And now, outside a police station, with officers mere meters away, he pulled out a knife. What went through Kyriaki's mind in those final seconds? Did she see him approaching? Did she try to run back toward the station entrance? Did she scream for the officers inside to help her? We know from witness accounts and video evidence that Kyriaki stabbed her 5 times in the back. In the back, she was trying to get away from him. She was fleeing towards safety that would never come. 5 stab wounds, each one a deliberate act, each one a choice to continue the violence, each one an expression of rage and control, and the ultimate punishment for a woman who dared to leave, who dared to try to live her own life, who dared to seek help from authorities. Kyriaki collapsed on the pavement outside the Agayo Anajari police station. Officers finally emerged, but it was too late. The woman they had refused to help minutes earlier was dying in front of them. Paramedics were called, but Kyriaki died before they could arrive. 28 years old, her whole life ahead of her, gone because every single system that should have protected her failed. The police who didn't prosecute her rape, the police who didn't adequately enforce the restraining order, the police who refused to give her a ride home, the emergency operator who mocked her fear, the officers who didn't perform a risk assessment when she reported her stalker, the colleagues who didn't check Kyriaki's background to see his history of violence. After stabbing Kyriaki, Kyriaki stabbed himself at the scene. It was theatrical, a final act of control, making himself a victim too in his twisted mind. Police arrested him, and he was taken to the hospital for treatment. He would survive his self-inflicted wounds. Kyriaki would not survive the wounds he inflicted on her. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Crime scene investigators arrived to document what had happened. The video was secured. Witness statements were taken from the officers inside the station who had refused to help Kyriaki. The knife was recovered as evidence. Kyriaki's body was eventually removed, transported away from the place where she had died seeking safety. But perhaps the most horrifying detail of the immediate aftermath is how Kyriaki's family learned of her murder. Not through official notification from police, not through a knock on the door from victim services. They found out via social media and contact from journalists. In the age of instant information, news of the murder spread online before authorities could inform her family. Thanosis and Despina, Kyriaki's parents, learned that their daughter had been murdered by scrolling through social media or answering phone calls from reporters asking for comment. The pain of losing a child is unimaginable. Learning about that loss through social media rather than official channels adds another layer of trauma. Another example of how the system failed Kyriaki and her family at every possible turn. They should have been notified immediately by police, should have been given support and privacy to process their grief. Instead, they were confronted with their daughter's death through the worst possible means. The investigation that followed was in some ways straightforward and in other ways deeply complex. The murder itself was captured on video. There was no question about who killed Kyriaki. Kyriaki had been arrested at the scene. The physical evidence was overwhelming, but the investigation needed to expand beyond just the murder to examine the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. Investigators had to review the police response to Kyriaki's request for help. They had to interview the duty officers who refused her a patrol car. They had to pull the audio recordings from the emergency hotline to confirm what the operator had said to her. They had to examine the history of Kyriaki's relationship with Kyriaki, including the rape allegation that police had failed to properly prosecute. The Hellenic police initially tried to defend the officer's actions, claiming that only an officer within the emergency response center could order deployment of a police car, as if bureaucratic procedure excused the failure to protect a woman in danger. But that defense rang hollow to a public that could see the video of Kyriaki being murdered outside the station. To a public that knew officers and a vehicle were present and available. The investigation revealed layer after layer of institutional failure. The rape case from 2020 that police had reduced to a physical injury complaint, despite being required by law to prosecute it ex officio. The lack of proper background checks on Kyriaki that would have revealed his history of violence and drug offenses. The failure to perform a risk assessment when Kyriaki reported her stalker. The refusal to provide basic protection in the form of a 5-minute escort home. The dismissive attitude of the emergency operator. The lack of training among officers about domestic violence protocols. Anonymous police officials began speaking to media, acknowledging errors in service, and primarily a lack of humanity that led to the tragedy. They described it as a terrible lack of adequate training and indifference among law enforcement. These admissions, while important, were cold comfort to a family grieving their daughter and a nation demanding accountability. The public reaction was swift and fierce. Protests erupted across Greece. Vigils were held in Kyriaki's memory. Demonstrators carried signs quoting the emergency operator's words about patrol cars not being taxis, turning the callous statement into a symbol of institutional failure. Women's rights groups organized rallies demanding recognition of femicide in Greek law, demanding better training for police, demanding accountability for the officers who failed Kyriaki. The case became a flashpoint for national dialogue about gender-based violence. Greece had seen 5 women killed by partners or ex-partners just in the first few months of 2024, and Kyriaki's murder was the most public, the most egregious, the one that could not be ignored or explained away. The fact that she died outside a police station made it impossible for authorities to claim they were doing enough to protect women. In January 2025, 9 months after Kyriaki's death, the Athens First Instance prosecutor initiated criminal proceedings against 4 police officers for the crime of fatal exposure by omission. Disciplinary actions were taken. A deputy commander was placed on 4 months mandatory leave. A duty police officer and security guard received 3 months mandatory leave. An immediate response officer was fined €450. Lawyers representing Kyriaki's family called these sanctions ridiculous punishments. A woman was dead because police refused to protect her, and the consequences were measured in months of leave and minor fines. The Greek National Transparency Authority appealed to the Council of State, seeking annulment of the decision and requesting dismissal of 3 officers from the force. But as of the trial in late 2025, full accountability for the police failures remained elusive. The arrest of Thanasis Karellis was the easiest part of the entire case. He was found at the scene of the crime with a knife, covered in Kyriaki's blood, wounded from stabbing himself. There was video evidence of the murder. There were witnesses. There was no question about what had happened or who was responsible. Karellis was taken into custody, treated for his wounds, and held pending trial. But the legal proceedings that followed would expose troubling attitudes about domestic violence and victim blaming that persist even in modern judicial systems. The trial of Thanasis Karellis began in June 2025 at the Athens Mixed Jury Court. He faced charges of intentional homicide in a calm state of mind, illegally carrying and using weapons, and supplying and possessing drugs. Since the murder was captured on video, the central question was not whether Karellis killed Kyriaki, but whether he could be held fully accountable, or whether claims of diminished responsibility would reduce his culpability and his sentence. This distinction matters enormously in sentencing. Full accountability could mean life imprisonment. Diminished responsibility could mean significantly less time in a specialized facility. Karellis's lawyer, Spyros Dimitriadis, built his entire defense around the concept of diminished responsibility. He argued that his client suffered from severe psychopathology, a history of mental illness, including psychotic depression and suicidal behavior. He cited medication use and alcohol use as factors that impaired Karellis's awareness of his actions. Dimitriadis even argued that the fact Karellis committed the murder outside a police station proved he lacked awareness, as if a rational person would never kill someone in such a public location. The defense requested the court recognize Karellis's reduced capacity, which could lead to a 15-year sentence in a specialized facility without parole benefits. Dimitriadis warned that pursuing a harsher sentence could backfire, potentially resulting in recognition of mitigating factors that could reduce the penalty to just 6.5 years. It was a strategic argument designed to pressure the court into accepting diminished responsibility rather than risk a lighter sentence on appeal. But Kyriaki's family and the prosecution weren't having it. They vehemently disputed the diminished responsibility claims, arguing this was a calculated tactic used by abusers to escape full consequences for their actions. The evidence supported their position. A court-appointed psychiatrist and the judicial council that referred the case to trial both concluded that Karellis acted in a calm mental state, fully aware of his actions and their consequences. The council went further, describing the attack as a deliberate execution following systematic and persistent stalking of Kyriaki on the day of the murder and the day before. This wasn't a spontaneous act by someone in a psychotic state. This was planned violence by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Karellis had no record of involuntary hospitalizations. Conflicting psychiatric experts testified, with some asserting the defendant likely had full awareness and was not under the influence of substances at the time of the murder. Kyriaki's father, Thanasis Grivas, provided testimony about the relationship that painted a devastating picture. He described it as coercive, exploitative, controlling, parasitic, and emotionally manipulative. These are textbook characteristics of an abusive relationship, the kind of pattern that domestic violence experts recognize immediately. Kyriakis hadn't killed Kyriaki in a moment of mental illness. He killed her because she dared to leave him, because she dared to seek help, because she represented a challenge to his control. But during the trial, something shocking happened that revealed how deeply victim-blaming attitudes persist even in the judiciary. The presiding judge questioned Kyriaki's father, asking why his daughter loved Kyriakis so much if he was abusive. Read that question again. A judge asking a grieving father why his murdered daughter didn't leave her abuser sooner, as if her death was somehow her fault for staying in the relationship. Thanasis Grivas gave the only answer possible. You should ask all the women who are abused and do not leave, not me. It was a perfect response that highlighted the absurdity of the question. Why do abuse victims stay? Because they're afraid. Because their abusers threaten worse violence if they leave. Because the system doesn't protect them when they try to escape. Because economic dependence traps them. Because psychological manipulation makes them doubt their own perceptions. Because society teaches women to fix relationships rather than abandon them. A member of the victim's legal team objected to the judge's line of questioning as inappropriate and abusive. And it was abusive. Questioning why a murder victim stayed with her abuser is victim blaming at its most egregious. It suggests that Kyriaki bore some responsibility for her own death, that if she had just made better choices she would still be alive. It ignores the reality that the most dangerous time for a domestic violence victim is when they try to leave, which is exactly what Kyriaki was doing when Kyriakis killed her. The trial also had to contend with the broader context of Kyriaki's murder and what it represented. Women's rights groups criticized that the trial remained officially framed as a homicide rather than as femicide, arguing this erased the gendered nature of the crime. Kyriaki wasn't killed randomly. She was killed specifically because she was a woman who dared to leave her male partner, because she challenged his sense of ownership over her, because she tried to exercise autonomy over her own life. Activists and social scientists had been pushing for legal recognition of femicide in the Greek Penal Code. They argued that adopting the term would make the phenomenon visible and give prominence to its social and gender dimension. Femicide is not just murder. It's murder committed on the basis of gender discrimination and unequal power relations. It's a crime rooted in patriarchal attitudes that treat women as property, that respond to female independence with violence. The prosecution had to present the full scope of evidence beyond just the video of the murder. They introduced the history of abuse, the rape allegation that police failed to properly prosecute, the restraining order that was violated, the stalking behavior on the day of the murder. They showed how Kyriakis' actions were part of a pattern of control and violence that escalated when Kyriaki tried to break free. The evidence was overwhelming. The video showed premeditation in Kyriakis approaching Kyriaki with a knife outside the police station. The multiple stab wounds showed sustained intent, not a single impulsive act. The stalking behavior showed planning. The history of abuse showed motive. Every piece of evidence pointed to a man who made a fully conscious choice to murder the woman he claimed to love, rather than accept her autonomy. On July 29, 2025, the Athens Mixed Jury Court delivered its verdict. Thanasis Kyriakis was sentenced to life imprisonment for Kyriaki's murder, plus an additional 5 years. He was also fined €1,000. The court rejected the diminished responsibility argument, accepting the prosecution's position that Kyriakis acted with full awareness and intent. Life imprisonment in Greece is equivalent to 18 years, though the additional 5 years extended the sentence. The verdict represented full accountability, the maximum penalty available under Greek law. It was a victory for Kyriaki's family, for prosecutors, for women's rights advocates who had pushed for recognition of the severity of femicide. But the verdict in Kyriakis' case was only part of the larger accountability picture. The trial of the duty police officer whom Kyriaki sought support from immediately prior to her murder started in November 2025. This officer faced charges of fatal exposure, along with the duty supervisor and a call handler. The duty police officer gave a deposition on November 14, 2025, and was released with restrictive conditions.